Hello and welcome to the Security Strategist. My name is Steffen and I will be your host for today's podcast. I am the Vice President of Research with Enterprise Management Associates, an analyst firm that examines how companies manage their IT infrastructure from the data center to the user environment and into the cloud. And I focus primarily on cybersecurity, compliance, and risk management. I love talking about that stuff. I happen to also love talking to the person that is joining me on the podcast today, Shannon Murphy, Global Risk and Global Security and Risk Strategist at Trend Micro. She's their chief evangelist and uber security nerd. She is awesome to talk to. And today we're going to talk a little bit about data security management. Before we really get into it, Shannon, why don't you give us a quick introduction of who you are, talk to me a little bit about Trend, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me back on, Chris. I love catching up with you. And these topics are so trendy, but also so important right now. Before we dig into that, though, just a little bit about me. Thank you for the great intro. My job here at Trend is really advising and advocating for security leaders, working with field teams to really understand what are
Best job in the world, by the way. Best job in the world. Please continue.
really working on, what are not just the emerging technologies that are really going to help us out, but also what are the emerging threats? What are the emerging risks? And then how can we actually model, some more modern programs to help address that type of thing? Quick intro for Trend Micro. This is a large cybersecurity platform player, pioneer in AI, pioneer in proactive security and risk management. So I think that our conversation today really falls into that category really nicely.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, Trend is absolutely a leader in this space. And I wanted to talk specifically about data security management. There's a whole category called DSPM, Data Security Posture Management. And let's start with a real simple concept. Talk to me about what DSPM is and the difference between data security posture management and data loss prevention. And how does an organization align these approaches to their business, to their overall risk and compliance goals, to their overall security strategy?
Totally. And I love that you brought up business strategy and also compliance strategy as well, because data is so important from a lot of different angles, right? Particularly when we're looking at what's going on in the AI space. Like there's productivity gains that you need to have really clean data in order to actually get the most out of those types of applications. There's security concerns, there's ethics concerns. And then there's also, questions around scalability as well. So I think when we're talking about data security, and maybe even in the context of AI, the first concern that comes up is data leakage or IP loss, right? And traditionally, maybe you might say, oh, we have DLP, that problem solved. But that's not the case, right? We know that that's not the case because the DLP is going to help us, in a lot of different ways. But what it's not doing for us is it's not finding that data. So doing that initial discovery and then doing that assessment, right? Cyber is all about managing risk. So we want to be managing the risk associated with that data up front. And to do that, we need to classify it. We need to tag it. We need to make sure that it's being stored in a safe way. The way that we're storing it isn't misconfigured or it's not vulnerable. Like these are the types of things that data security posture management is going to help us do. So really, if I can sum that up in a simpler way, it's, your first critical step is really getting the visibility. And without the visibility into what your data is, where it is, we're already kind of starting off on the wrong foot. So I think this is kind of what I would say is the key difference.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I always when I talk about data security at large, there are many steps in the data security program, and you can add as many of these as you'd like to, but there's three fundamental ones. And the first one is data discovery. You got to know where your stuff is. Okay. And it's a challenge. And no matter what you might think, you still don't know where all your data is. You might think you do, but you really don't. And that's okay. You can phone a friend and they can help you figure that out.
For sure. And it's continuous, right? Like it's not like you have data at a point in time and that's all the data you're ever going to have.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, there's, you're constantly making more data. So you got to figure out where you're putting it. Even if it's something as simple of, another test S3 bucket, or you signed up with another cloud service provider or whatever have you, you're creating more data. The second one is after you've figured out where your data is, then you got to figure out what your data is. So data classification is the second one. And that's a challenge, right? Because you don't really have a way of really diving into the data to determine what it is in the grand scheme of things. That's somewhere where AI can come in and figure out the difference between a code snippet and a lunch order, right? One is something that you want to protect. The other one is something that you don't really care about.
Yeah, in an invoice or a phone number, there's so many things that you want to be able to have something that's really scalable and automated that's going to help you do that tagging and classification.
That's right.
To take away a lot of that manual effort.
Yeah, and the third one, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is data custodianship. Once you've figured out where your data is and what your data is, who is responsible for securing, owning that data, classifying that data, whatever have you. And that's a real challenge too, because that's usually a very human process. But you really can't do the third one until you do the first two. And the methodologies that you use to do all these parts, there's a difference between DLP, which is a critical part, right? You don't want to lose code snippets. You don't want to lose social security numbers. You don't want to lose credit card numbers. But at the same time, that only goes so far. And how you structure your environment, how you structure your data security strategy is going to be critically important, and it will help you determine what kind of tools you need to be able to do that.
Totally. Yeah. And I would also reinforce as well that data security posture management is the way to modernize the way that you're approaching
no question
data security. However, measuring risk in silos is never going to be effective. So you want to have a broad security posture management program as well. You want to be able to see across your entire cloud environment, including your services. You want to be looking at your identities as well. So having data in that broader program is really going to put people in a much more resilient position.
I completely agree with you. And the next thing that I want to talk a little bit about, and I mentioned it a little bit already, with the rise of AI and LLMs and so on and so forth, how should organizations be rethinking their data security strategy to protect sensitive information while leveraging some of these latest AI achievements?
For sure. So there's actually probably two pieces here. One is around your company's enterprise AI adoption. So what are your business units using? What is your sales team using? What is your finance team using, right? Like we need to be able to govern that usage and govern what data is being surfaced to different types of people. This comes back to a zero trust conversation that you and I have had before. But then there's a secondary pillar here, which is around go-to-market. So if you're a company that is actually going to be selling an AI application, and honestly, Chris, who's not right now?
No kidding.
That's another consideration as well. So what data is being used for the product that you might be selling? And you need to be thinking through that as well, especially, in either category, things like anonymization come up as really important. So the way organizations need to be thinking about this is in kind of two categories, but at the same time, there's commonalities. Industries or geographies that are highly regulated, they might need to be keeping that data in I call it a baby cloud or a private cloud with specialized security for that environment, right? So maybe if you're in banking and finance or healthcare or critical infrastructure, maybe you do need to isolate that data even more. For organizations who are operating largely in the cloud, which I think is probably going to be the majority of cases, simpler cases, they're going to want to do, that continuous data discovery using things like DSPM. They want to monitor for suspicious activity using XDR. So if they're seeing data moving around in a way that's really anomalous, you want to be able to detect and respond on that as well. And then, of course, you want to classify all of the most important data that's actively in use, whether that is for the adoption, whether that's for the go-to-market, and whether that's in a private cloud or a public cloud.
Yeah, you talked about data classification, and I think that we don't talk about it enough, right? There's one school of thought that basically says, let's just encrypt everything and go, to the soccer game. Okay, well, that's great, but that's not realistic, right? There are things that you need to be protecting. There are things that you need to be understanding. And the example that I gave earlier, there's a difference between an IP, intellectual property code snippet, and my lunch order for the local sub shop. One you care a lot about, and the other one you probably don't care at all about. And no, I'm not referring to my sub order, right? the reality of it is that you want to protect your financials. You want to protect your PII. You want to protect your intellectual property. Mm-hmm. And we sometimes overlook that idea. That data classification is something that, is an afterthought. How can businesses move beyond that? How can businesses move beyond primary classification and use metadata for more intelligent, context-driven, that kind of protection when they're taking and going through this process?
Yes. And I love that you said this. Like, here's the thing, right? A document isn't highly sensitive until you put something highly sensitive in it. So this is also a continuous process. But metadata, the AI piece is going to help us here as well through some things like character recognition and then making a determination on whether it's the sub or the PII or the invoice, and then doing the tag assignment from there. But the way that the metadata can help us is through a few different things. So I think the first is probably tracking the data flow. So the metadata can surface whether that data is, where it's moving across the organization, who's interacting with it, if it's changed, if it's moving from a secure server to an endpoint. And, these are the types of things that we want to see. And then by getting that visibility and that observability, we can actually trigger a reclassification to a more sensitive level. You can also look for anomalies as well. So we can detect the behavior patterns, right? So if that data is being accessed by an identity, human or non-human identity, from, odd locations, odd hours, this can help do some classification changes as well to say that this data is now high risk. But let me know what you think about this.
Well, no, I totally agree, right? And one of the other things and this is kind of the next question that I have is that the metadata so the data is important. Don't make no question about it. But the metadata from a risk and management perspective is critical. Because not only can you classify data that way, you can also determine its data custodianship. You can determine who is using that data. So, for example, in any hypothetical situation where I have 10 pieces of data and I see that Shannon is looking at those 2 pieces of data 90% of the time, and the other 10% are some one-off, once a month, whatever is going to be. But Shannon is the one that's looking at that data most of the time. When I am trying to determine data custodianship for that piece of data and looking at access records, who logically should I go to? Well, I know for a fact that the conversation always defaults to the security guy. The security guy is responsible for securing it. But you don't want the security guy to be responsible for your financial, for your HR records, for your salary reports, for your intellectual property. They can help you encrypt it. They can help you store it, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, that's not your guy. Your guy is the person who is going to be responsible for that data, uses that data, understands that data, so on and so forth. So in the hypothetical that I just came up with, Shannon looking at that data all day understands what the data is, the importance of that data, and what we should be doing with that data. So logically, who should be the custodian for that data? And the answer is Shannon, right? And so using the metadata to understand those kind of things, I think is critically important. I think it does 2 things. One, it takes and gets people involved, and it fosters that idea of security, of the importance of security and specifically data security throughout the organization when you get people involved and get them to be engaged with the process.
Paternalistic about their data, for sure.
I don't want a bunch of control freaks. That's not what I'm trying to get at. But it doesn't make any sense to take and have a wide swath of 10 million employees and, the security guy interviewing all 10 million saying, would you like to own this piece of data? And because that's never going to cut it. Okay. So taking and using some of that behind the scenes background metadata to determine data custodianship makes all the sense in the world.
For sure. And then there's things like masking, right? And then this also, again, comes back to zero trust, because zero trust also applies to our security personnel. So when it comes to data custodianship and data ownership, that trusted employee or that individual whose job is that they're responsible for that data and they're accessing it, then, we're cool with that. If something changes, if they're accessing it from an unsecured device, then the metadata can also trigger, maybe an additional verification step or deny access or something like that. But I'm totally with you. Like, data custodianship should not be siloed. And I think that every team, whether it's your security team or your IT operations team or your legal or your operations team, they need to understand their role in their responsibility for that data as well, which is definitely a perennial challenging problem to try and tackle.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, right? And again, I've heard so many examples of where I don't want to be bothered with that. I don't want another responsibility. But the reality, it is your responsibility. If you are in operations, if you are HR, if you are in finance, you do have to take some responsibility over the data that's being used in your organization. And helping the security team do that, removing it from the security silo and out through the organization, only makes logical sense. I really want to take and talk a little bit about how organizations can realistically use a data security strategy, and specifically DSPM and DLP, to improve the culture of security, right? You're basically using DSPM and DLP in a way that will create a layered defense that involves emerging threats, solves a lot of these problems, and more to the point, creates and reinforces that security culture. Talk to me a little bit about that.
For sure. I mean, our mantra as cybersecurity pros and security nerds is defense in depth. So what I would really urge people to think about is not just stopping at DLP. Truly, we're in a completely different era where data is worth its weight in gold. Data is a real currency to the bad guys and to the good guys, right? Having clean data, having an approach where we're continuously assessing our risk and we have really fine-tuned this is all good for business, right? This is giving a competitive advantage. To the bad guys, data is literally worth money, right? If you exfiltrate the data, you're set up for beautiful extortion opportunities. So defense in depth and not just stopping at the DLP. These are two things to really think about. And like I said earlier, data is overwhelming. You have to prioritize your data, especially highly sensitive data. You need the visibility and you need policy. So real-time classification is going to become so increasingly highly relevant. And then we need to think about the operational side as well. What are we keeping in hot storage, cold storage? Who has access to it? Where is it? And then from there, we can start to determine how we want to lock it down, depending on its use case and what we want to use it for. So lots to think about from a threat and risk perspective. There's more exfiltration. Jailbreaking is like the number one topic trending on the cyber criminal forums. Targeting models, targeting digital twins. Like, digital twins have become such a trendy topic. These are the types of concerns that you want to be modeling your data security for. And all of this and more is going to require a modern approach, a modern tech stack in order to contend with these types of challenges.
I totally agree. If you have one takeaway and you are one of our security nerded brethren when it's all said and done, keep in mind that specifically from a data security perspective, which is something, again, very near and dear to me, it doesn't have to be something that you have it all done at once. This is something that it will be an ongoing process. It is not something that, you're going to wake up one morning and say, yep, we're going to have data security by the end of the week. And it doesn't work that way. And so expect that you're going to be working on it for a while. And it's okay. And it's okay to phone a friend, right? Talk to the folks at Trend. Talk to the folks at any of the other companies that are out there. There is plenty of folks out there that are willing to help you. Heck, you can talk to me. I mean, I obviously have an opinion on all this too. But data security, you're going to find, is going to become more and more the core of your cybersecurity strategy. And that's exactly where it should be.
Absolutely. AI is truly a forcing function to rethink our tools and our strategies when it comes to how we're protecting data. And just relying on, your traditional technologies that you've had available, it's almost like bringing like a knife to a gunfight, right? You really need to be layering in continuous discovery and really shifting the mindset from point in time or, singular layer approaches to a real active guardianship, I guess you could say. So, and taking that guardianship across the entire life cycle of the data. So from creation, when it's in runtime, when it's at rest, when it's deleted, like you want to ensure integrity at every single phase of that data's journey and its life cycle in our organizations.
Yeah, great summary. And once again, Shannon, rock star that you are, I really, really appreciate you joining me here on the podcast today. Your insights are literally world-class. If you are not following Shannon on LinkedIn and all the other 500 gazillion places that she's speaking on any given week, literally anywhere in the world, by the way, that's not even a joke, you really should be. Again, obviously, really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Also, thank you to everybody who came onto the podcast and listened to us today. I hope you took away something from the podcast. If you'd like more information about what we talked about, please head over to Trend Micro. You can also ping Shannon. You can ping me. We're always happy to respond. We'll be back next week with another episode of our podcast series. Until then, make certain you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms and follow the conversation on our social media channels, EM360 Tech on X and LinkedIn. And for more great daily content, head over to em360tech.com. Again, Shannon, thanks. Everybody, thanks for listening.
Thank you.